We have a God who doesn't think like men think and who doesn't act like men act. My thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. As as the heavens are above the earth, so I am my ways above your ways, and my thought above your thought. Isaiah chapter 55 from verses 8 to verses 9. Man has a natural tendency to disqualify his fellow men when the latter feels incapable, powerless, weak, and vulnerable. God, on the other hand, rejoices when an incapable, impotent, weak, and vulnerable man expects him. In this condition, God activates His sufficient grace, which is the secret of the success of heroes according to God. God's grace is a powerful and deep truth that no man can understand and explain with intelligible words. It is an undeserved favor that God does to all those who feel unable without Him and spiritually poor. Jesus Christ said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Matthew chapter 5 verses 3. God's grace is that dead hand road in the eyes of men that God uses to take us to the top. God's grace is that automatic system that is activated when our human's effort come to an end and we cry out to God. God's grace is also that supernatural ability that makes us capable of doing things that are impossible for men. God's grace is God in action through us who makes extraordinary things that no one could have expected. It is by God's grace that Abraham, born of idolatrous father, becomes the father of faith. It is by God's grace that Jacob became Israel. It is by God's grace that Joseph, betrayed by his brother, became the most powerful man in Egypt at the side of Pharaoh. It is by God's grace that David, a simple shepherd of the sheep, became king of Israel. It is by God's grace that Gideon, the smallest of his father's household and from the poorest family in Manasseh, delivered Israel from the hand of Midian. It is by God's grace that Simon Peter, a weak and vulnerable man, became a bold man through whom the gospel of Jesus Christ was spread with the leadership of others disciples. It is by God's grace that Saul of Tarsus, a cruel man and persecutor of the church, became a firm disciple of Christ. God could tell Paul when he cried out to him to remove the thorn from his flesh, "My grace is enough for you, for my power is fulfilled in weakness." 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verses 9. From this, we understand that God's grace is active in man's ultimate weakness. In what do you feel weak? In what do you feel vulnerable? What have you given up or are ready to give up? Do you feel unable to persevere in your work with God and in holiness? Then rely on God's grace. Do you feel unable to live a life of permanent victory? Then rely on God's grace. Do you feel unable to live and fully accomplish God's will? Rely on God's grace. God's grace locates only those who feel unable, powerless, and weak without God. If you feel weak in any area, don't give up. Ask God for His grace. God's grace draws its strength in man's weakness. If you feel weak, then you are qualified to be lifted up by His grace.